So, Dave, in many respects, a lot of what we have seen over the past couple of weeks, some of the greatest symbology, I guess, is a function of something that happened a couple of years ago. And obviously, you've been covering this. It's the taking of the knee, which was Colin Kaepernick's response to the killing of black men and women by the police, that in many respects ended his football career, and in some respects it's all come full circle.
It certainly has, and it's so interesting looking back at 2016 because I believe it was August 19th, 2016, a preseason game that Colin Kaepernick was not even starting, where he made the decision just to sit during the anthem behind his teammates that were standing. And Colin Kaepernick, who's a very intelligent guy, who's not like a big rah-rah guy, wasn't doing it for attention, wasn't doing it to make some kind of grand statement. He was doing it because he was so disgusted, as you mentioned, by the killings of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling. And it was a sports writer, ironic, I think this is ironic, for the NFL Network, who went up to Colin and asked him about why he was doing what he was doing, Steve Weish. And that's where Colin just went off about police brutality and about not paying tribute to a flag as long as police officers go free after killing people. And what's interesting is that, that started the firestorm, and then Colin consulted with Nate Boyer, who is a former Marine and former NFL player, and it was Nate and Colin together who came up with the idea of taking a knee because, and this is one of the greatest miscalculations, I think, in the history of anything, is Nate thought that it would not be seen as controversial. It would be seen as respectful if Colin took the knee. And, of course, that was not the case when you're talking about the reactionary forces that be.
Yeah, I mean, that may have been there may have been some truth to that, I think, maybe in a different era, right, with a different president. But this
Exactly.
was, but Donald Trump saw an opening to weaponize this, and he did. And Colin Kaepernick became this lightning rod. And here we are now, 3 years later, nearly 4 years later, I guess. And well, maybe we should talk about the NFL response, right? Because in many respects, there's almost like the NFL is trying to take a mulligan here and sort of shove some history down the, the rabbit hole. But give us a sense of how the NFL responded at that time.
Well, at that time, the NFL responded by affirming that they disagreed with what Colin Kaepernick was doing. They quite explicitly did not have his back. They were far more concerned with either upsetting Donald Trump and his Twitter finger or members of the NFL ownership fraternity actively supporting Donald Trump and therefore fundamentally disagreeing with what Colin Kaepernick was doing in very bad faith, like actively misinterpreting what he was trying to do and the message he was trying to send. That whole reframing of the protest as being against the anthem and the flag in America and not in opposition to racial inequality and police violence. So that was their first response to Colin Kaepernick. And the next response had much more teeth. It was simply not re-signing him after the 2016 season, a season which Colin Kaepernick played really well for a terrible San Francisco 49ers team. There was just no place for him on any NFL roster, and that was the beginning of his exile, an exile that's produced lawsuits, an exile that's produced demonstrations, including one I was at in front of NFL headquarters of over 1,000 people, and an exile that included hundreds, if not low thousands, of high school and college athletes who in 2017 took a knee as inspired by Kaepernick, but as their own protest against police brutality and racism in their hometowns. So it sparked what I would argue was a groundwork for so much of what we're seeing today in so many communities.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think because it really, I mean, it was effective. I mean, it was effective. I don't know what Kaepernick's a specific agenda was. If he sat down and had a notion of like 12 months out, 18 months out, 36 months out, I want this or that to happen because of this. But it certainly became a an opportunity, largely for, I think, for white America to educate themselves at least to some extent, right? I mean, people were talking about it.
Yeah. You make a really good point by focusing on white America, because one of the worst media framings of Colin's protest was when people said America is polarized over this issue of taking a knee. America is polarized. But when you actually drilled down on the numbers, it was white America that was polarized.
Right.
Over Colin doing this, because overwhelming majorities of non-white Americans said, yeah, we support his protest and we support what he's trying to accomplish and what he's trying to say. And so it was an opportunity to do what was Colin's original goal, which was very simply to start a conversation. He certainly didn't expect it to blow up the way it did, but it was just to be able to start a conversation about how to stop police officers getting away with murder. That's what it was. And he says, let's have this conversation. And it seems like now that conversation is finally happening, but it took a 50-state national uprising and, of course, several more lives, including the lives of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, to make it happen.
All right, I want to talk about two more topics that I know you've written about recently. One is, on one hand, how, broadly speaking, athletes have, and it sort of feels like maybe there was, there was a cycle in terms of this too, with athletes sort of seeing how effective the industry was able to eject Kaepernick in many ways, and in some ways, like his protest, the taking of the knee died down, and then it was quiet, and now it's almost as if like there's been a rebound effect, forgive the pun, with athletes, both black and white, reasserting themselves. And we're not talking over a long period of time, and maybe they were always being assertive, but more consciously, more deliberately asserting themselves politically.
Oh, no doubt about that. And if we're talking strictly about taking a knee, so many NFL players have already pledged that they're going to do just that, including leading white players like J.J. Watt and the quarterback for the Cleveland Browns, Baker Mayfield. And that's new and that's different. And a lot of players are saying, of course I'm going to do it. We have a problem in this country that needs to be addressed. Heck, the entire National Basketball Association had plans to restart their season playing in a biodome in Orlando because of the pandemic. And that could be scuttled precisely because of the argument made by Kyrie Irving, among others, that NBA players, which is, of course, an overwhelmingly majority black league, shouldn't be providing bread and circuses for the people right now, shouldn't be providing distractions that sports can often provide, precisely because we're engaged in this national conversation. And this conversation should not be diverted to now people talking about the NBA. I mean, it's a remarkably self-conscious approach that these athletes are taking with regards to the struggle itself in the streets. And that's the part that I also think is really fascinating, is for the first time, I think, since the era of Dr. King, when people like Jackie Robinson and Bill Russell marched in the streets, you're actually seeing athletes in the streets, not in this sort of rare air, protected by managers and gated communities, but athletes in the streets marching with the people, building demonstrations, talking about what they're going to do. LeBron James talking about voting rights immediately after seeing the long lines in Georgia. I mean, this is athletes in full flex mode right now, showing what they can accomplish. And that's a big deal, because in the urban uprisings in the late 1960s, it wasn't uncommon for athletes to be sent out to quell uprisings, to calm people down, even sent out in their uniforms to do just that. This is a very different moment, and you see it by the number of athletes who have actually taken to the streets. It's one of those things where when it first happened with 2 or 3 athletes, I was like, whoa, this is amazing. But now I'm losing count of the numbers who've been part of these marches.
I mean, is it your sense that this is an awakening amongst athletes, or is it that this has been something that they have been suppressing? Do you know what I mean? I mean, maybe it's a subtle difference, but I'm curious as if like there was an ongoing feeling of whether there is the moment compels them, or whether it is that the moment is they do not fear the way that they feared stuff before.
I think it has to be both. I mean, doesn't it? Because the uprisings have been so broad and vast, and the ideological capitulations among people like Roger Goodell, for example, the commissioner of the National Football League, have been so extreme that they're feeling their own power. So because of the power of the streets, they're feeling their own power to flex. And they were part of building that confidence of the power in the streets. So I see it all as very, very interconnected, because one thing is for certain is that this power has been there all along. And I think that the minders of sports that's their great concern, is really the athlete, and more specifically the black athlete, becoming self-aware of their own power, which we're seeing right now like no time since the late 60s. But I think what's happening now is even wider and deeper than what we saw in the late 60s. I mean, we have to see how long it lasts, but the sheer number of athletes, the sheer number of sports, the tenacity of the demands, I mean, it is a very powerful moment at the intersection of sports and politics.
I wonder too if, and this isn't something that's exclusive to sports. I think it's society wide. There's some of this, that because everything else is suspended, and maybe it's an extension of that theory that we shouldn't be playing basketball now because it would be a distraction. But because of the lack of distraction, because on some level, like there's no option of of passivity, right? Like, if the season is ongoing and basketball players are playing, and or whatever sport it is for that matter, or people are going into work every day, you simply need to be somewhat passive to not get involved in what is happening. And you just go about your business, and every day you go to work or whatever it is. In the absence of that, it changes the dynamic. You need to be, there is no routine for you to do. Like, you're out there, and everything that you're going to do in this at this time when we're in the midst of this pandemic is proactive on some level, whether it's you're going to try and start playing again, or whether you're going to go out onto the streets. And it's really then becomes a choice that is on sort of equal footing on some level.
Boy, yeah, I agree with that so much. I mean, the pandemic I think has to be central to the analysis of why we're seeing this 50-state national uprising. I mean, when you have mass unemployment, mass frustration, mass anger at the state of things. And then I think one of the variables also was honestly seeing those small demonstrations of white armed protesters at places like Michigan, the reopened protests, and seeing that get handled with kids' gloves by the police and praised by Donald Trump. I think that was a variable in this also. But I think for athletes, there's a 12-month commitment to being a pro athlete that often involves having blinders on for that entire 12 months and being very singular in your focus. And to have those blinders removed, I think was also like a very powerful variable in all of this. This idea of taking a step back, being able to look at the broader society. And then you have these tumultuous cases with George Floyd and Arbery and Breonna Taylor, and this being something that created a perfect storm where athletes were saying, whoa, this is not only is this awful, but we have some influence in shaping the demonstrations and the demands that are to follow. We can do this. And then, of course, they have an incredible amen chorus in the streets that's ready to take actions.
Lastly, I mean, you've written that sports have an opportunity, professional sports, I would imagine maybe college sports too, have maybe a fairly unique opportunity to impact white popular opinion in a way that other aspects of our culture don't. Explain that.
Sure, but sort of the results of that, first of all, are right now 61% of the United States thinks that Colin Kaepernick was right to take a knee during the anthem, and they would support athletes who do that in opposition to police brutality. That's an incredible number, 61%, given how polarized it was in white America. I mean, the basic argument is that when, like many white Americans have the option of opting out of caring about racism and police violence because it doesn't affect their lives. And yet when athletes do it, all of a sudden it's on sports radio. I mean, ESPN has basically been running the stories of athletes who've been involved in these protests 24/7. And that's a function of the pandemic, of course,
right,
because they don't have sports to cover. So this becomes what sports has to cover and debate and talk through. And that has the power to puncture privilege. That has the power to put the issues in front of white eyes and force them to confront and take a side in what's taking place. And I'm just very gladdened and heartened by the fact that as people are being forced to line up and take a side right now and realizing that you can't be neutral on this particular moving train, that people are siding with the forces of justice, much more so at this point anyway than the forces of reaction.
What do you think happens next? I mean, how it feels like the NFL is trying to sort of, like I say, reposition themselves because in some ways it feels like the players have gotten out ahead of it, that, capitulating to Donald Trump is not in the necessarily the best long-term interests of the NFL as a brand. And let's be honest, right? Like that's all they care about in the final analysis. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there are individuals there who might be sympathetic and some who might not be. I mean, who knows? But in terms of their brand, it really is just it's in some ways it's a bellwether. And I'm curious as to, how you think they're going to be able to sort of, particularly when sports come to the front again. I don't know when that's going to be when we play, but it's one thing that the NFL is issuing a press release. It's another when we start to see how players and then the teams react to this stuff. What do you expect?
Great question. I mean, I think they're exactly what you said. They're putting their fingers on the pulse of popular opinion and responding accordingly. They can read the polls as well as we can in terms of Trump's popularity, re-election prospects, but they also understand that they're a 70% black league and they could be in a state of full revolt and non-compliance with what the NFL wants to do, precisely because of this movement that's happening in the streets. So I don't know what the future is going to hold. I think that NFL players are not going to be in any way happy unless they see Colin Kaepernick actually rehired and signed to a team. I think that would go a long way because the symbolism of that for players is so incredibly strong in terms of, is the NFL serious or are they full of crap? And I think the other thing is that they want to start to see people in ownership positions in the NFL have something to say. Because while Roger Goodell has made these statements, you haven't seen exactly the lining up of franchise owners or executives behind him. They tend to be quite the conservative lot, and they're not saying anything. So we'll see what happens there as well. But it's very hard to predict because the situation is so volatile. I mean, in the last week, you've seen athletes at Texas say they're not going to be part of activities with boosters unless certain demands are met. I never thought I'd see that. In Oklahoma State today, players are coming out in rage just as the coach of the team, Mike Gundy, was photographed wearing an OWN shirt, OAN, that idiotic news network that Trump follows. It's just because a random photo of there he is with an OWN shirt they're in full rebellion at Oklahoma State of all places, not exactly a hotbed of rebellion. So it's so hard to predict what's going to happen in a month, in a week, hell, tomorrow.
And lastly, let me ask you this: we're in this sort of, I don't know, this ambiguous, very strange time within a strange time where we don't have a full sense of just how bad things are going to come with the pandemic. In some areas, things are improving slightly. In other areas, it's going the absolute wrong direction, and it's not like the virus is going anywhere. And we're also on the cusp of, it feels like, starting to feel the impact. I mean, obviously, about 40 million people have felt the impact of losing their job. But there is this sort of broader sense of like, we're fine. The worst of the economic stuff is over. We're rebuilding. I'm hesitant to believe that. Do you think that there is a weird sort of solidarity that is taking place that is sort of, I don't know. There is that because of, we're hitting this point where there's a sort of like a greater class consciousness that's going on during this time where people are seeing the bailouts go to corporations, and wealthy people are sort of like, their biggest problem during this pandemic is what kind of ice cream they have stored away in their fridge, and that greater sort of like class consciousness somehow being afforded to football players, many of whom make a tremendous amount of money, or basketball players make a tremendous amount of money, but that their struggle is with ownership. And so there is a sort of like some type of empathy or simpatico nature in terms of like fighting against, I don't know, maybe it's some fractal inequality. I'm not exactly sure how to articulate it, but do you follow what I'm saying?
Yes, and that's totally there. Howard Bryant, in his book, The Heritage, he describes Black athletes as being the most prominent Black employees in the United States. And I think that formulation is important because as much as we may think of athletes as superheroes or as living charmed lives, they are at the end of the day employees. And we understand that their time in the spotlight is very brief, and we understand that when they speak out, they actually risk that time in the spotlight. They risk everything that's been handed to them, and that gives them a certain social weight that, say, an actor doesn't have. It's like Colin Kaepernick has more weight than, say, George Clooney, for example, to take a politically active actor, for example. There's a sense that one has the element of risk in speaking out, and one does not. One is an employee, and one is really not in the same kind of way, in the same kind of social relationship. And that makes a huge difference. And I do think you're seeing people getting it both instinctually and explicitly, that the sides are lining up and the athletes in the streets are on the right side of history.
Dave Zirin, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Sam.
Thanks, Dave. Really interesting
stuff. Thank you, and best to you and yours.
Thanks, you too.